Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. Today I'll be looking at the first music from 1993. Kiss 100 FM Transmission 1, date unknown.
I suggest that you reach deep down inside yourself there and try and find something that'll keep you awake just a little while longer, because this transmission coming up may just rekindle your will to live.
This silent running sample is an incredibly fitting way to start 1993 for multiple reasons. Firstly, the literal. This would be the start of a deeper, more atmospheric kind of transmission to 92's test transmissions. Secondly, the long term. This sample would be used to open a huge number of FSOL transmissions over the years, its use here signifying the start of that era. And thirdly, the personal. This show rekindles my will to work on this series, because I'm not the biggest fan of the Passion Music era. I love Accelerator and Principles of Motion and loads of individual tracks, but as a combined body of work, the band's 90 to 92 output is not why I'm a fan. It's certainly not why I'm the sort of fan who feels committed to creating a huge YouTube series about all 1,000 plus tracks that they've released. The start of 93 is the point where FSOL begin to feel like the FSOL that grabbed me when I was a kid and never let go. A quick word about dating. As discussed on the previous video, there is no solid information about these earliest transmissions, with the 19th of May date given for what is likely two different shows. Neither Kiss Transmission 1 nor 2 lines up with bootlegs labelled 19th of May, so I've given up trying to be accurate and just popped this down as an unknown date in early 93.
You are listening to a test transmission for a new form of information transfer. Not only are you receiving audio, but you are also receiving image and text data. Test transmission begin.
It will be a few months before the Tales of Ephidrina press release announcing the start of the FSOL Ultra Media Enterprise EBV, but at this point the broadcast system had very much begun. A Mixmag article from later in the year confirmed this. Their recent guest show on London's Kiss FM featured not only all the latest sounds and pulses, but also another signal, computer code. They were simultaneously broadcasting machine code for tripped out Apple Mac computer graphics to go along with the music. While this would be more prominently advertised for the 1994 3D Headspace tour, it was evidence that even at the start of 93, Brian and Garry were already looking beyond simply being a band.
Look, we gotta work together on this, okay? Now, I want the names of all the places you lived, all the schools you went to, friends, enemies, acquaintances, good memories and bad.
The opening section features further environments and spoken samples that will become part of the general transmission DNA throughout 93 and 94. By this point, the pair had realised that while Yage and Cyberface were certainly fun, they also added a sense of novelty to the shows that could be better replaced by film dialogue. They also didn't want to be typecast as Yage and Cyberface, and while Kiss FM wanted more of it, the band decided to drop them. The film clips would give a sense of continuity and some abstract narrative, tying in with the band's desire to create actual radio shows rather than simply DJ mixes. After the intro comes another key moment, the opening environment of Cascade. Still a year until the album's release, the band give us a sneak preview of Lifeforms. This is followed by an unidentified track which is largely considered to be an unreleased FSOL piece. The leap between the test transmissions and this show is huge. This feels like several steps on in terms of style and maturity. At this point we get our first non-FSOL tracks, and it's straight into ambient techno, IDM territory, rather than the club music of 92 shows. Tracks by Link, Higher Intelligence Agency, The Orb, the KLF and Brian Eno round out the first half hour in true non-dance style. Who knows what Kiss made of it at the time. The tracks are overlaid with numerous film samples, many of them still unidentified.
It's called Daisy. 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 Give me your answer to. I'm crazy. All for the love of you. It won't be as large.
HOW 9000's death scene from 2001 A Space Odyssey, a commonly used sample throughout the Lifeforms era. The Asian Cyberface do reappear briefly in a reused part of the first test transmission in which they discovered the Emerald Forest in the sample library stage 4. This, rest assured, is their very final appearance. Indeed, the same guy called Gerald track follows, suggesting this is just a chunk of that transmission ported over. It's quite startling how much ambient music is in this show. In my mind, the Kiss 93 shows began largely dance oriented and the band began to deconstruct the sound over the course of the year, but even at this very early point the music has shifted very heavily away from the dance floor. Part 2 starts in full-on ambient territory, over a blend of Jimmy Corty's Space Project and a Reload track. The first use of one of the band's most sampled spoken sources appears, with two characters from a 1965 radio version of Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea discussing using high-frequency sounds to scare off a giant squid.
Well, our sonar device sends out high-frequency sounds.
I know.
Now, some animals, like dogs for instance, can't stand high-frequency sounds. It hurts their ears.
But I don't see any ears on that giant squid.
And then a brief appearance of Dead Can Dance, one of Garry's loves from 4AD, not to mention originators of a certain vocal sample. Some brief Lifeforms environments and then some atmospheric techno from Trance Setters before a left turn back into ambient territory with a dive into a 70s Klaus Schulze track. The use of a 1973 prison drama Papillon as a form of vocal sample is slightly unusual in contrast with most of the film samples which tend to come from science fiction movies. That's unsurprising given the general nature of the band's concepts at the time and the sci-fi babble from the Asian Cyberface that the film dialogue samples replaced. After a bit of ambient IDM from Speedy J, the band treat us to some more Lifeforms material, this time in the form of Elaborate Burn, one of the album's most ambient pieces and clearly an early track from the sessions. It's worth remembering that at this point Tales of Ephidrina was yet to come out, and yet here the band were treating listeners to music from the album after that. And then Cabaret Voltaire and even some 70s French space disco just to confuse listeners further. Kiss FM would often play hardcore and early proto-jungle in the early hours. No wonder there's still people out there with vivid memories of their minds being blown by the weirdness in these shows.
Every time we have the argument, you say the same thing to me, you give me the same three answers all the time, the same thing, well, everybody has a job, that's always the last one. But you know what else there is no more of, my friend? There is no more beauty. And there's no more imagination, and there are no frontiers left to conquer. And you know why? Only one reason why.
Silent Running is by far the most heavily sampled film in FSOL history. Huge chunks of dialogue are replicated over these shows and continue to appear in some form or another over the coming years, including a respoken section on Meadows from The Isness in 2002. The film's chilling portrayal of humanity's apathetic destruction of the final remnants of nature feels almost at odds with the future-oriented world the band liked to portray at the time, although this is really only just an example of their dichotomy at the heart of everything they've done. Their music, of course, has always been made out of out-of-date gear and samples of music from previous decades. The appearance of a Deep Forest track at this point is intriguing, as that group always straggled the uncomfortable line between the ethno-ambient and new age schlock worlds, usually landing uncomfortably on the wrong side. I'm strangely fond of the particular track here, however, and it feeds bizarrely well into the Derek May piece that follows. The tracks in the mix are mostly linked together with environments, some of which will be familiar to fans in this form, others would be later slowed down for use on Lifeforms, but many remain exclusive. Around 8 minutes into part 3, Birdsong that would later turn up on The Isness appears, tying together seemingly disparate parts of the band's catalogue. I won't mention every time an environment appears, but listeners will no doubt find the glimpses of the gradual creation of Lifeforms' sonic world over the course of '93 intriguing. Adding to that, we also get Vertical Pig and the Darshana remix in close succession. It will be easy to consider Lifeforms a 1994 record, that's when it was released after all, but the Kiss mixes go on to show that this version of the band's sound is rooted in '93.
Listen carefully. Wow, listen! I never knew that fish could be so noisy.
That 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea sample is interesting because the voices are slowed down, or at least pitch shifted down, in a manner that more and more voice samples would be as the mixes evolved. This effect gives the voices a detached, somewhat inhuman quality that adds to the psychedelic, unearthly nature of the mixes. Excerpts from this radio play continue throughout the mix. You'll spot them, they're usually about fish. The sample is followed by a track by Diff Juz, another 4AD favourite of Garry's from the 80s. FSQL would actually cover the track around this time, although it remains unreleased. and Diff Juz member Richie Thomas would work on Dead Cities and the Isness, as well as recording a sadly unissued album for EBV in '97. The Diff Juz track is followed by Agog in the Ether by Osric Tentacles, the track sampled on Cascade and Flak. The Osrics were actually a favourite of Nick Philpin, manager of the studio block Earthbeat was a part of, and more of him later.
How do you feel, Johnny? A little sleepy. Well, try to relax. We mustn't use up any more oxygen than we have to. We only have a half-hour supply left.
Things have got a bit darker since we last met Johnny in his fish spotting. This rather bleak sample is directly followed by an organ performance of music hall favourite Beside the Seaside. It's extremely amusing and a pairing that will be used well into '94. It's at this point that Brian and Garry throw in the first proper dance track of the show, currently unidentified, over 2.5 hours in, and apparently it's time for some techno. They like to confound. It's the start of a short section of dance music before heading into some Peter Gabriel soundtrack work and, astonishingly, Kai from ISDN, a track that would not be released until well over 2 years later. While much of that album was recorded after Lifeforms, it's remarkable to think that chunks of it were recorded at the same time as Lifeforms' earliest material. More than 2 years after its release, Mental Cube's Child of the Bass Generation feels a little out of place on the mix, even overlaid with samples from Last of the Mohicans. Midway through part 5, a new sound appears, hip-hop. The instrumental version of Run DMC's Beats to the Rhyme is quite a tonal shift after 2 hours of ambient and IDM, but in hindsight it feels like the starting point of a particular sound Brian and Garry would begin to develop, particularly on the 1994 material recorded for ISDM. One can clearly hear the roots of tracks like Wanting and Snake Hips here. After a sample of the film Millennium, Part 5 ends quite remarkably with Cascade Part 2, all 9 minutes of it. It's a hefty chunk of the show to dedicate to one track, and particularly unusual as material from the band's singles were rarely played on the transmissions. Mildly interesting aside, there are 2 totally different artists called Space on this mix. Jimmy Corty's project based on his part of the initial Orb sessions, and the French space disco outfit responsible for Magic Fly. The final half hour of the show returns to the format of the opening section, with Corty's Space alongside other ambient techno material from the period, including names who'd come to define the era like Biosphere, Aphex Twin and Higher Intelligence Agency. Further material from Eno and Cluster, with a track that would reappear on the Electric Brainstorm series 25 years later, and Dead Can Dance manages to bring together the musical interests of both Brian and Garry. And then the mix closes on the dub and Dumb Child of Q mixes of Papua New Guinea in an unusually backward-looking move for the band. While the development between the first test transmissions showed FSOL shifting away from straightforward dance music towards more cerebral-sounding techno, nothing could have really prepared listeners for how much further out they were travelling. It's an astonishing show and one that was only a hint of things to come. Brian and Garry began 1993 with a bang, and they were only just getting started. As with Test Transmission 1, the version sold on the Podroom in 2008 came in 6 half-hour segments, no doubt how it was created before supplying a single blended mix to Kiss, and this version forms the basis of the track list that I've put in the comments below. There's no known bootleg version of this. Kiss 100 FM Transmission 2, 19th of May 93. Also released as Transmission 4. I'm going to do something a little unconventional here. Over the years I've come across at least 3 different bootlegs of the transmission that was broadcast on Kiss FM on the 19th of May 93. They are all clearly from different sources. Someone has tried to piece together the bulk of the show from the different versions on Mixcloud, and all of them match up perfectly with the show that was released in the Podroom as Transmission 4. My guess is that Transmissions 2 and 4 got mixed up somewhere in the archives, as the one that was released as 2 is very heavy on Lifeforms material that makes it very similar to shows 5 and 6. So I'm swapping them here. The show I'm talking about as Kiss Transmission 2 was released as Kiss Transmission 4 and vice versa. On with the show. The second Kiss transmission of 93 begins with Arizona, the environment that links Liquid Insects and Swab on Tales of Ephidrina, still unreleased. This is followed by samples of people interviewed about their thoughts on electronic music. Typically some of the responses are complaints about it becoming faceless and talentless, others talk about the mind-altering experiences of electronic music. It's a really strange way to open a radio show. No music, no announcements, just 5 minutes of abstract sound and strangers talking. Eventually our familiar robotic friend announces moving further into the future sound of London, and things finally begin to take off. There's another sample from HAL 9000 from 2001, something that occurs throughout the mix. The first track in the show is Mountain Goat from Tales of Ephidrina. With that album's release only a few weeks away, the appearance here makes sense. Interestingly, it's the first full Tales track broadcast since '92, with the first Kiss transmission focusing largely around Lifeforms material. It leads directly into the intro of In Mind, following the album's original structure, albeit with more samples layered on top. This would be the band's last transmission before the album release, so it's not that surprising that a fair bit of it's used. It's then followed by a piece by avant-garde trumpet player John Hassell, the first occurrence of jazz in an FSOL show. And by no means the last, it's followed directly by a free jazz piece by Gruppo di Improvisazione Nuova Consonanza, and it took many attempts to get that right. It's clear Brian and Garry want to take listeners somewhere very different from both their own past and Kiss FM's standard fare. Of course, then the show goes off into ambient techno and ambient dub territory for the rest of the first half hour, and somehow it all just about blends. The second half hour of the show begins with Cascade's intro environment and its close cousin Flak, the fourth track from Lifeforms to be broadcast on Kiss FM, with still a year to go before the album's release. The experimental Morton Subotnick piece from 1967 that follows may also be familiar to Lifeforms fans. This is followed by more traditional techno fare from Detroit political producers Underground Resistance and occult-leaning Dutch outfit Psychic Warriors of Gaia, combined with a John Lydon interview from his Sex Pistols years, Brian being a huge Pistols fan of course, and obscurely a snip of Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells. This is FSOL in confrontational mode.
Please ensure your audio coupling device is interfaced.
This is imperative.
You are entering Audio Copyright Zone 2. Warning, spoiler technology is in use.
One of the most frequently used watermarks gets its debut here during a weird section blending ambient pads with jaunty jazz piano. It's quite a chaotic moment of sound collage and possibly one of the less successful. After a fairly techno-oriented half hour, Part 3 dials things back down with more exclusive Lifeforms material, 208, and some IDM from Link and the Black Dog, and a couple of 23 Skidoo tracks. 23 Skidoo, one of Brian's favourites from the weirder end of the post-punk movement, have of course been sampled on countless FSOL pieces over the years. The section ends with a couple more tracks from Tales of Ephidrina.
For further information on any aspects of this broadcast, contact PO Box 1871, London W10 5ZL. Copyright has been retained in the sound and visual.
Fans did get in touch at the time, more on that when I get to the white version of ISDN. Part 4 sticks largely to IDM, Aphex, 808 State and Global Communication all appear, while taking a couple of diversions into early synth music. Although a huge early influence on Brian, Tangerine Dream rarely appear in FSOL mixes. My introduction to them was through this very transmission, and Betrayal remains one of my favourite of their tracks. Wendy Carlos's Purcell interpretation, used as the main theme to A Clockwork Orange, blew my mind when I first heard this show in my teens, and its appearance here, flying in after the opening environment from Among Myselves, is magnificent. The bootleg most widely circulated among fans in the early 2000s began about 10 minutes into Part 3 with what is believed to be an unreleased FSOL track, and ran for 69 minutes, separated somewhere as the cassette was flipped. It was another that I played repeatedly during the long gap before the band returned in 2000, and this Tangerine Dream and Clockwork Orange section was a particular favourite moment.
The following transmission has been conceived by the Future Sound of London. For those of you with access to an Apple Mac Quadra series, this will be an audio-visual broadcast. At selected intervals throughout, image and text data will be transmitted. Please interface your acoustic coupling device. Each of the resultant images require approximately 10 megs RAM and have been modelled and rendered at EBV.
At which point, no doubt, anybody connected to fsol.demon.co.uk would have seen a low-bit graphic of some sort. It's a shame there's no archive of the image and text data transmitted from Earthbeat at the time. Frustratingly, there's nothing on Wayback Machine prior to February 2002, as not only would it have been a fascinating look into the early days of multimedia on the web, but it's also an aspect of the band's history that's completely forgotten to time. Even if only a handful of people managed to connect, it was still an FSOL experience that was completely ephemeral. Part 5 begins in ambient mode, Eno, Namloop, Global Communication, Atom Heart, before heading into darker and weirder territory with Ross 154, followed by a bunch of previously broadcast but then unreleased FSOL tracks, including once again Kai, not officially released until mid-95.
If you have encountered problems with your data compression, please ensure that the squelch ratio has stabilized before connecting the audio coupling device. Any further problems, contact pin M3000.
What does any of this mean? The final half hour reintroduces the answer phone environment, including an invitation to an ambient tea party, no doubt from Mixmaster Morris, as well as a phone call made by the No Consciousness, an art collective Brian was involved in Glasgow in the early 80s. There's plenty more Eno, a few more names from the ambient techno 90s, The Orb, Namlook again, Wolfgang Voigt, as well as another appearance of Diff Juzz's The Last Day, clearly a band favourite at the time. The show closes fittingly on HAL 9000's Death from 2001. Hal was our companion throughout the transmission, so what better way to end than on his ultimate demise. All in all, the second Kiss transmission is an odd affair. It introduces more environments, more Tales of Ephidrina and Lifeforms material, and expands the FSOL sound world to include avant-garde jazz and 60s experimental electronics. At the same time, it features more overtly dance-based material than the first transmission, and in doing so feels like an odd halfway house rather than another bold step forward. The broadcasts would pause at this point while the band released Tales of Ephidrina and the long-awaited return of FSOL with Cascade, before picking up with a weekly slot in November. The 6-part version from the pod room is the source of the track listing below. Once again, it's no longer available for purchase, but it can be heard on YouTube and Mixcloud. Amorphous Androgynous, Tales of Ephidrina. Release date 3rd of July 93 in the UK and 30th of July 93 in the US. I remember looking in the sleeve of Lifeforms back in late 96 after I'd first discovered the band and wondering why on earth there was an advert for an album by another band on the inner sleeve. By this point I'd begun recording tapes of my own music on my own and with school friends under various different names, and yet it hadn't occurred to me that other people would use more than one band name for their music. I often considered asking my local indie record shop to order a copy in anyway, just so I knew what it sounded like, but to my shame I never did. In the end, the album, and the other album by Amorphous Androgynous, Environments, remained a mystery to me until I got internet access at home. And that's when I discovered that there was an FSOL album I'd never heard. It was the first full album I downloaded from Napster, and I regret that because I had to acquire it a track at a time over the space of a week. And being an impatient teenager, I didn't wait to have the whole thing before listening to the tracks. So I never had that initial playthrough, approaching it as an album from the start. Because of that, I've always had a slightly distant relationship from the record in the way I haven't with other FSOL albums, other than perhaps the Calendar albums. In some ways, Tales of Ephidrina has come under more fan scrutiny than any of the group's albums, certainly their 90s ones, because of what it is. Their first album released on Virgin, and yet put out under a new alias. After using various alter egos during their Passion Music era, it was perhaps expected that they would settle down a little on a major label, and yet they'd started with releases under new names, Metropolis and Amorphous Androgynous. So fans speculated as to the album's origins and purpose. The most popular theory was that Tales of Ephidrina was an album of Lifeforms outtakes, tracks that never fit the FSOL album and were thus released on their own. I never really felt this fit, though even ignoring the practicalities, Lifeforms would have been nowhere near finished by the time Tales actually came out. The two albums just sound incredibly different. The truth is, Tales of Ephidrina was recorded as an intentional album in its own right. A lot of the idea came from Tony Thorpe, member of industrial funk group 400 Blows and perhaps best known as the Moody Boys, the experimental house project who remixed for KLF and provided a mix for FSOL's first Kiss test transmission. Thorpe suggested the band record another album before their proper FSOL major label debut, a transitional effort to ensure they kept focus on the music and not stardom, as if. It was also an opportunity for the band to try out their new ambient approach, give it to Virgin to see what they make of it, see if they can market this more experimental music. Their A&R man Rob Manley was on board straight away and really pushed this to Virgin, who admirably decided to go with it. Whatever the exact reasoning, it certainly worked practically. The album was a gradual introduction to the deeper sound the band had begun to work on. And as Garry told Melody Maker in '92, we don't want the future sound of London to be a functional dance band. We see ourselves going completely outside that area. We want to push dance music beyond its boundaries, but push everybody outside dance music as well. We're not limiting our music or our appeal to the dance music scene. We're thinking much bigger than that. And while this meant Lifeforms, the difference between that and Accelerator was huge, and thus Tales of Ephidrina was a perfect stepping stone. That was actually quite a measured step. We basically sacrificed that album so that Virgin around the world could market research the area we wanted to go in, because we thought Virgin knew fuck all about it. So that was kind of like a sacrificial offering so they could get some knowledge. Speaking to Mixmag in '94, Brian was a little less conceptual in his description. When we signed to Virgin, it was a chance to be free. With that freedom we returned to what we were doing before, which was scrapping around with sound and playing. While scrapping around with sound and playing feels like Dougans downplaying the music, it feels right in some ways. The music on Tales is less rigid than the band's Passion music work, even at its most experimental, more atmospheric, more surprising, and more environmental. Where Accelerator was pieced together with bursts of electronic sound and reverbs, Tales features the band's first fully fledged environments. The US cassette edition even includes them in the tracklist, while all others offer them in a slightly jumbled manner on the fold-out booklet's flowchart. The environments tie together unidentifiable sound samples, field recordings, dubbed-out percussion, subtle electronic washes, and film dialogue and foley, and link the tracks seamlessly, the album playing out as two gapless side-long suites. Some, like Tall Buildings, are brief interludes, while 13th Century Katichi and Midpoint run to well over a minute and are memorable in their own right. The music itself fits the halfway between Accelerator and Lifeform's brief perfectly. Half the album still relies on four-to-the-floor kicks, while the remaining half mixes down-tempo breakbeats, dub bass lines and beatless ambience. The approach to production is similarly far more complex than found on the band's debut, but a shade simpler than what would be heard the following year. In general, even the more dance-leaning tracks are less energetic than past listeners would expect, the kick drum acting as more of a hypnotic pulse rather than a dance floor-oriented beat. By the time of the album's release, London-based fans would have had the opportunity to hear most of it already. 5 of the album's 8 tracks and 4 of its environments had already been played on the group's first 4 Kiss FM broadcasts. Indeed, by this point the broadcast had already begun to focus on Lifeform's material as much as that from Tales, the sign of a band always moving forward and looking to, well, the future. Nevertheless, for most people it was the first big release from the band in the 14 months since Papua New Guinea hit the charts. And although Garry's write-up on the old EBV site has the band stating, "You mustn't advertise, this is strictly Amorphous Androgynous," a press pack did go out jointly announcing the album and EBV, the band's new label. Many of us have come to think of EBV largely meaning electronic brain violence, but back in '93 the phrase didn't exist. Instead, EBV meant Earthbeat Vision, described as an ultramedia label set up by the Future Sound of London to explore through its product the ever-converging fields of electronic music, audio-visual, broadcast, literature, advertising, film, photo-video graphics and artificial intelligence. This was clearly the beginning of FSOL moving away from being a band and towards being a broadcast system. The press release is a remarkable document in itself, a rare example of the band referring to examples of their own music and how it's intended to be heard. While, with no reassuring shape or sex to download the dream, the listener's imagination must be online to the music, this is the point of access, hints at the idea of pure music, which needs no band interviews or explanations to be enjoyed, it's the talk of environments which is the most revealing. The use of environments is a vital piece of research. When the album begins, for example, there is a sense of anticipation, almost fear, as Liquid Insect slots into rhythm. The podroom doors have been opened, there's no going back. But the all-important key which has unlocked these doors is 13th Century Katichi, the preceding environment which provides the focal point of entry for the imagination. As environment flows into track into environment, the album takes on a seamless quality. It's a rare glimpse into the band's way of thinking about tracks and albums that very few interviews have ever really touched upon. The other thing the press release introduces is the EBV logo. Familiar to most fans from its inclusion on almost every FSOL release from '93 onwards, it couples together the EBV lettering and the Earthbeat logo, without the Earthbeat legend from previous releases. The logo adorns the back cover of the album, as well as the inner sleeve and gatefold, and the CD and record art. It was clearly intended to make an impact. The art in general is a huge step up from previous Boogie covers, incorporating heavily doctored photography and the computer-generated imagery. The front cover itself is striking, notable as one of Boogie's most abstract images. There appears to be elements of a bird in there, particularly feathers, but the overall image suggests some kind of surreal structure or indeed environment. It's hard to describe and unlike his other work, but very impressive. Coming after the monochrome images and block lettering of his Jumpin' and Pumpin' covers feels like an even bigger leap forward than the music itself. The inner sleeve features a montage of photographs and CG images, the photographs both raw and digitally altered, none of which are as successful as the front cover but show that a fair amount of the Virgin Advance had been spent on visual equipment as well as music gear. The other half of the inner sleeve shows the aforementioned flow diagram, itself including all 16 track and environment titles, Offspring and its hymn for some reason left off the US cassette track list, as well as various line graphs and odd phrases, possibly there to designate aspects of the music, possibly there just to look cool. Ring modulation and oscillator filter certainly suggest musical aspects, Leslie point and dry vortex less so. The press release has this to say: "The diagram flow set out on the album presents the new complexity compositions of the future sound of London. There is a flow from start to finish, and yet there is no flow. There is only intersection, a myriad of possibilities, individual capacity to project imaginatively. This diagram attempts to indicate the temporal dimensions of a linear spectrum of thought, evoking intersections. It gives the opportunity of choice." There's a lot more, although it's just as impenetrable as that. It can be read in full in the most important moments of a life book. One aspect of the future that isn't set out on the artwork is the credits section. As it had become clear that the fictional scene built up around the band with the various early aliases would be disbanded, some new names appeared. The album is listed as being produced by Philip Pinn. Pinn gets his name from Nick Philpin, the manager of the studio block Earthbeat was located in. Ever keen on wordplay, the band changed his surname into Phil Pinn and then Philip Pinn. The name took on its own life and thus became another fictional member of the FSOL enclave. When used in stories, Pinn usually indicates Garry. In the case of the Tales credits, he's simply Brian and Garry, much in the way that Amorphous, Androgynous, FSOL and Yage are. The fact that they chose to credit themselves under 4 different aliases in one 3-line credits section probably says a lot about them as people. Similarly, the Analog Room as a studio was another invention created to add more mystique. And of course it worked, as it was generally believed that the album was recorded elsewhere, produced by a friend. The final aspect of the sleeve is the equipment used to record the album. Gearheads will no doubt be fascinated. EBV as a label wasn't a true independent entity until '97, and here acted as a sub-label of Virgin's own quasi-independent offshoot Quigley. Thus, as with Metropolis, the band still remained without a true Virgin release despite having been on the label for going on towards a year. In the US, the album came out as the inaugural release on the now legendary electronic label Astralworks, itself part of the Virgin family and home to all of Rob Manley's signings. The US release demanded a larger font on the cover for some reason. There's probably a snide joke about Americans to be made there, but otherwise it was identical to the UK version. Without a single, or even a familiar name to promote it, the album received rave reviews but made little impression on the national charts, although it did reach a very respectable number 3 on the UK Independent Album Chart, coming in behind big hitters Björk and Suede. For its 20th anniversary, Brian and Garry dug up a couple of alternate takes which Astralworks duly posted on their SoundCloud page, link below. For its 30th anniversary, an expanded version with 4 bonus tracks and a remastering job was released. Liquid Insects, incorporating 13th century Katichi. Tales of Ephidrina opens with the Predator sampling 13th century Katichi, one of the album's identified environments. It opens with sound effects from the sci-fi action film combined with various other samples, creating a dark, sinister feeling of foreboding, sending the very important message, Papua New Guinea this ain't. The opening blast is followed by water, flutes and synthetic whooshes as part of a 90-second burst of abstract sound. For those who hadn't heard the band's Kiss FM transmissions, this would have come as a huge surprise, as it's considerably more dense and atmospheric than the primitive between-track environments used occasionally on Accelerator. The band set out their stall here, opening with a piece which makes it very clear that this is a very different and new era. Once 13th century Katichi is over, things revert to what might be considered normal, with pulsing synths and a fall-to-the-floor kick. Liquid Insects is probably the most straightforward track on Tales, the one that would have worked in clubs at the time, pushed by driving drum machine work and classic breakbeats. Indeed, I've seen footage online of Darren Emerson playing it back in the 90s. Melodically, it moves between 2 themes, the opening synth pulses and a repetitive flute motif. It is largely this flute that sets it apart from their 1992 work, lending a more exotic vibe tied less to the sci-fi concepts of their early tracks. Somehow they also managed to fit in funk guitar samples without them feeling out of place. It's a powerful driving track that kicks off the album in excellent form. The track itself, as well as a cryptic reference to its title, were first broadcast on the second test transmission. The final few seconds of the track form the very start of the next environment, Arizona, which leads into the following track. Swab, incorporating Arizona. That opening Arizona environment is a collage of synth whooshes and dub delay-soaked percussion. The second index on the CD begins with a short muffled spoken sample. I always thought it was In Mind, referencing the album's 4th track, but it turns out it's You Might. Arizona was first broadcast on the second Kiss transmission. The whole environment actually has roots in earlier sessions, turning up at a higher speed on the Smart Systems track You Might in 2007. Swab itself soon takes over and reveals that Tales of Ephidrina isn't simply techno with more atmospheric links. Despite a fairly fast tempo, the track is breakbeat led, sampling numerous drum loops and samples, showing off the group's most rhythmically complex piece to date. A brief ethnic vocal loop hints that this might be a Papua New Guinea sequel before all thoughts of that are dispelled. In fact, it's largely rhythm led with little in the way of melody. The group's now trademark sampling provides a huge range of mostly percussive textures, giving it a very tribal feel. It's never been one of my favourites, I've always been a sucker for melodies, but it's hard not to appreciate it as an incredible work of sampling. Mountain Goat. Probably the best known track on Tales of Ephidrina, partially through its use on countless ambient compilations over the years, partially because of its sheer beauty. When asked about his favourite track in '94, even the then cynical Cobain had to admit its quality. None of it really, I just see the problems, I don't see the good points. I guess Mountain Goat actually, on Amorphous Androgynous. It even made it onto the FSOL Best Of Teachings from the Electronic Brain in 2006. It would go on to be the first of the band's re-recorded tracks, reworked for a 2014 Café Del Mar compilation. The track, debuted a couple of months before its release on the Second Kiss transmission, follows straight on from Swab, even incorporating its final synth chord as a key textural element. This is followed by the main acoustic guitar loop, played by Garry and recorded into a digital delay unit, the hold feature allowing several sections to be looped and combined into the melody you hear on the track. This immediately singles this out as something different, a guitar-led track. It builds with layers of synths, flutes and odd metallic percussion into something hypnotically beautiful before a classic Schooly D drum loop comes in, reminding us that this is the 90s version of ambient where rhythm is still an important factor. This section brings a darker mood to the track, a wonderful contrast where many ambient musicians would have chosen to continue building the main theme. This only serves to highlight the beauty of the guitar section as it returns for the outro. Words don't do this one justice. Mountain Goat is the moment Brian and Garry took a big step forward, moving on from excellent techno producers to create their first genuine masterpiece. It's by far my favourite track I've covered in this series so far, and it appears on many fans' lists of favourite FSOL tracks. An absolute classic, and a sign that the band had grown from humble and intriguing beginnings to masters of their craft. In Mind, incorporating midpoint. Coming in without a breath, or indeed an environment, save for a sample of running water, after Mountain Goat, In Mind tones down the previous track's emotional intensity for a starkly atmospheric piece. The skeletal rhythm is almost bossa nova-ish, reminiscent of the kinds of built-in rhythm tracks on early electronic organs, as used by the likes of Cluster in the early 70s. Indeed, the twinkly three-note melody is similarly reminiscent of that particular group's childlike innocence. In Mind is no homage, however. The shimmering pads in the background are lifted from the cold sci-fi techno of the group's earlier Indo-Tribe sound, while the whispered titular vocal sample and layers of unidentified sounds lend a sense of foreboding to proceedings, making it possibly the most sinister sounding piece on the album, and possibly of the group's career to this point. The track was broadcast before the album's release on the Second Kiss transmission. It and the first side of Tales of Ephidrina close with the album's third environment called, fittingly, Midpoint. The 80-second piece ups the weirdness levels considerably, with slowed down chanting and clapping before a jaunty flute melody comes in, followed by chanting monks, all finally overwhelmed by pummeling samples and growling synths. It's early 90s ethno-ambient gone wrong. Enigma and Deep Forest turned on their heads and warped into a disorienting nightmarescape, dispelling in the process any worries that FSOL might head in similar directions. Amazingly, it dates back to '92, first appearing on Test Transmission 2. Ephidrina, incorporating Slow Blow. As far as environments go, Slow Blow is a fairly unassuming one. Percussion with some delay, a few quiet animal samples in the background. And it kicks off the second side of Tales of Ephidrina in a somewhat misleading manner as it precedes the punchy, epic 8-minute almost title track Ephidrina. The track returns to the 4-to-the-floor kick approach of Liquid Insects, but slows the tempo right down. While the language here is still that of techno, it's no longer danceable at this speed. Indeed, unlike the bulk of the album, the track is almost entirely synthetic, with squelchy synth melodies and a continually modulating 303 bass line leading things, with fewer discernible samples in the mix, giving it a feel of one of the group's 92 tracks played at 33 instead of 45. It eventually builds to a crescendo, with layers of samples finally punching their way through the mix and some dark piano notes, before a brief deconstruction at the end. A deceptive piece that, despite repetitive elements, reveals a lot on repeat plays. Auto Pimp. Following one stripped-down techno-aligned track, Auto Pimp continues in a similar direction. The opening environment is unlisted on the US cassette edition of Tales of Ephidrina, but the somewhat confusing flowchart and the liner notes and the spoken sample used suggest it's probably called It's Him, even though Offspring is actually listed at that point on the graph. "It's him, it's all 'cause of him," a man shouts, followed by some helicopter sounds, and then the track starts in full. Unlike Ephidrina, the kick drum pulses back to normal techno speed again, but it's only joined by heavily filtered hi-hats, giving it a stark, skeletal feel and no groove. Synth string pads and a plucked melody are the main focus, the pads in particular giving it a melancholic, nocturnal vibe. As with much of the album, the track is a touch more minimal and repetitive than usual for FSOL, but repeated listens reveal more and more layers, the usual FSOL samples mixed slightly lower but still very much present. The 2-minute beatless outro section is a particular highlight, making it one of my favourites on the album. It was first broadcast 2 months prior to the release on the second Kiss transmission. Fat Cat. A brief opening environment, probably called Offspring, features layers of speaking voices, with "It Was Dark" and "What's Happening" being the only clearly understandable ones. Fat Cat itself, named after the London record shop of the same name, which later became a record label, begins shortly after, starting with its main haunting theme, a descending synth sample that immediately makes the track one of the most memorable on the album. Despite having beats largely throughout and a driving bass line, the staggered nature of the rhythm makes it feel closer to ambient music than anything danceable. An oddly sprightly synth melody joins, brightening the nocturnal mood somewhat. Of all the tracks on the album, Fat Cat comes closest to fitting the 90s ambient house sound popular at the time, with considerably less weirdness than most of the tracks, as well as best representing Garry's description of the group's sound as euphoric sadness. A beautiful track and a real album highlight, its only flaw is the very abrupt ending that takes me by surprise every time. Its title was first mentioned on the second test transmission in '92, and it was first broadcast prior to the album's release on Kiss Transmission 2. Pod Room. Incorporating tall buildings and cactus. Cutting in straight from the very abrupt end of Fat Cat, Tall Buildings is a particularly strange environment, sounding like slowed down animal calls put through dozens of filters and effects. After a run of fairly conventional sounding pieces on the second side of Tales, Tall Buildings brings us back to the surreal darkness of the first side for the album's closing section. Podroom itself is an early example of minimal techno, a single 4/4 kick drum and 303 bass line being the track's only mainstays. Stripped back and repetitive even by Ephidrina's standards, these elements are used as a backing to various samples, largely flutes playing haunting melodies, possibly in non-western tonality. Subtle percussion fades in during the piece's second half, and the track is accompanied at times by vinyl crackle. The repetition and dark atmosphere are almost oppressive at times, and for a long time I really hated the track. It's grown on me a lot over the years, however, and these days I appreciate just how effective an atmosphere it creates. It's also the second example of the band ending an album on a track that's a long way from the more conventional epic style closing track. The album itself closes on its weirdest environment, and a track that would probably get pretty good odds if betting on the strangest moment in FSOL's entire catalogue, Cactus. 20 seconds of sinister laughter, whispered voices and synth splurges, followed by glorious synth arpeggios, which were first heard as backing music to the Earthbeat central computer on the test transmissions, and then closing on Birdsong. It's utterly bizarre, and finishes Tales of Ephidrina on a hugely memorable note. Both Tall Buildings and Cactus were broadcast before the album's release, the former on Kiss Transmission 1, the latter on Test Transmission 2. Podroom itself would later fittingly lend its title to the podcast section of FSOL Digital. Although no conventional single was released, Liquid Insects was released as a 12-inch, only in America, judged by Astralwerks as a great way to promote the album to the college radio scene at the time. That makes, to my knowledge, the B-side Skyscraper the only FSOL track never to be released in the UK. It still surprises me that Virgin didn't take up the option to release it themselves. The A-side features an edit of Liquid Insects, lacking most of the 13th century Katichi opening environments and the closing Arizona environment, but otherwise the same version as the album, this suggesting that 13th century Katichi might only be the opening Predator and Water/Flute section. The B-side also features album track Mountain Goat with a simple fade in and fade out at each end. The aforementioned Skyscraper remains exclusive to this release, and thus it's one of the most obscure tracks in the band's catalogue. The 12-inch was released in both clear and black variants, with the black apparently the less common of the two, somewhat surprisingly. A white label promo was also released. There's no artwork, it's just a generic Astralwerks sleeve. The B-side label art is almost certainly by Boogie, although he's uncredited, and it does include the EBV logo, while the A-side is a simple generic Astralwerks label. Unusually, it has a Caroline Records catalogue number. Caroline was briefly the parent label of Astralwerks at Virgin at the very start of its existence. Skyscraper. One of the most obscure tracks in the band's catalogue, Skyscraper has only ever been released on the long-deleted, US-only 12-inch single of Liquid Insects, and it's the only 90s style Amorphous track not to feature on an album. It's immediately clear why the track itself didn't make the album. The sound is quite similar to the exclusive pieces from the early Kiss test transmissions, like Plasmatical and Tokyo Travel. Less dance-oriented than Accelerator, but lacking the sample collage atmospherics of Tales of Ephidrina. Indeed, if you push the kick drum up a little in the mix, it still fell well in clubs, being a largely uplifting track led by bright synth stabs and a funky bass line. There are still samples in the mix, a wordless female vocal loop provides counterpoint to the synths, and various flutes and wailing sounds feature in the background, adding a slightly darker touch. Nevertheless, it feels like a track trapped between eras, an idea of what a late 92, early 93 FSOL album might have sounded like if one had existed. An extended version of the piece ended up on the expanded Tales of Ephidrina in 2023, finally making it less obscure. And that's it for today's video. I would love to hear what you think of the music and transmissions discussed here. Please do drop me a line in the comments below, and there are also like, subscribe and share buttons you might also feel like pressing. I'll be back very soon with the next volume of 1993, looking at 2 more Kiss transmissions and Cascade. I'll see you then.